During preparation for my up-and-coming video, the third and final part of my Trump, Twin Tower and Synchronicity series, I came across something so intriguing that I felt it warranted a video of its own. It revolves around the Back to the Future trilogy, movies written by Bob Gale and directed by Robert Zemeckis. I read an article on DejaReviewer.com, posted in August of 2014, which explains how the Back to the Future movies follow a chiasmus structure. I have linked the eye-opening article below in the description, as it is where I drew much of my information. If a story has a chiasmus structure, it has symmetry. Events or ideas are listed in one order and are then repeated in the opposite order, forming a complete narrative. Stories like this are often found in ancient literature, including religious texts. The events in the first Back to the Future movie reflect the events in the third Back to the Future movie. The events at the start of Back to the Future 2 reflect the events at the end of Back to the Future 2. So, if we look at the trilogy as one long movie, the entire narrative is fully symmetrical. Part 1 focuses on Marty.
Whoa, this is heavy.
And Part 3 focuses on Doc.
Great Scott!
They go on the same journey, but in reverse order. They even echo each other's words.
Great Scott!
I know, this is heavy.
I will now present these findings as a scene-by-scene comparison, so get ready, because you're going to see some serious shit. Scene 1. Blown Down. The first time we see Marty in the opening of Part 1, he is blown to the ground after cranking up Doc's enormous amp to the maximum volume. The last time we see Marty, at the end of Scene 3, he is blown to the ground by the train time-travelling machine. Whilst recovering from the blowback, Doc calls giving Marty instructions, and in the last scene he emerges providing words of wisdom. Clocks are prominently featured during the first scene, and during the last scene, Marty is given a photograph featuring the clock that first allowed them to travel back to the future. Scene 2. A critical moment. During both the second scene of Part 1 and the second off last scene of Part 3, Marty interacts with Jennifer. In Part 1, he expresses his insecurities.
What if they say, get out of here, kid? You got no future. I mean, I just don't think I can take that kind of rejection.
As well as his desire to own a truck. In Part 3, Marty is driving that very same truck, and we see him refuse to let his insecurities get the better of him.
Think I'm stupid enough to race that asshole?
In Part 1, Marty is worried about the future, and in Part 3, Jennifer is worried about the future. Marty is given the flyer, which provides the information about the clock tower, which enables Doc to send him back to the future. Jennifer finds the printout she took from the future, which soon reveals a change of timeline. Raised. Both of these moments are critical links in the chain of events which follow. Scene 3. Home Sweet Home. In Part 1, Marty gets home and finds his dad being pushed around by Biff and the car wrecked by Biff. In Part 3, Marty returns to find Biff taking orders and waxing his truck. In Part 3, everyone is happy and healthy, but in Part 1, everyone is miserable. Scene 4. The DeLorean. The DeLorean travels through time for the first time in Part 1 and for the final time in Part 3. In contrast to the dramatic blaze of glory during its debut, the DeLorean's final journey slowly grinds to a halt in a rather lackluster manner. Both scenes feature the spinning license plate as the DeLorean vanishes before Marty's eyes. Number 5. In the Nick of Time. Just before Marty makes his first journey through time, he is chased by Libyan terrorists who pull out guns and shoot Doc for stealing the plutonium that he needed to power the DeLorean. Before Marty travels through time for the last time, Doc pulls a gun on a train conductor, enabling them to steal the train that is needed to power the DeLorean. In Part 1, Marty is retreating. In Part 3, he participates in a rescue. On both occasions, the DeLorean makes it to 88 miles per hour in the nick of time. When Marty arrives in 1955, he accidentally drives into one of Peabody's pines, killing it, and thus the Twin Pines Mall becomes the Lone Pine Mall. The last thing Marty does in 1885 is help Doc rescue Clara Clayton, and the ravine, known in the original timeline as Clayton Ravine, changes to Eastwood Ravine, the name adopted by Marty in the Wild West. Scene 6. Making an entrance. Now in 1955, Marty enters a cafe and is viewed with suspicion due to him being unfamiliar. In 1885, Doc enters the bar and is greeted with warm familiarity. Marty begins his search for Doc, almost revealing his digital watch, an item from the future. Meanwhile, Clara goes in search of Doc, and she discovers his plans, demonstrating how he will travel through time. Number 7. Tannin Trouble. The Tannins have been pushing people around throughout the ages. In Part 1, George wimps out, succumbing to Biff's demands. But in Part 3, we see Marty standing up to Mad Dog Tannen, defeating him on his own terms. Scene 8. Knocked unconscious. After following his teenage father, Marty is knocked out by a car, taking George's place and preventing his own future birth. Back in 1885, Marty's intervention between Doc and Tannen prevents Doc's death, as seen when Marty's name replaces his on the tombstone. During this scene, Doc is the one who is knocked unconscious. Scene 9. A passionate encounter. Marty sleeps in Lorraine's bedroom and wakes up to find his teenage mother filled with lustful passion towards him. In Part 3, Doc cannot sleep. He visits Clara and she is filled with passionate rage towards him. Number 10. Erased from existence. After finding Doc and convincing him he is from the future, they both head out and retrieve the DeLorean. In Part 3, Marty and Doc hide the DeLorean. In Part 1, Marty uses his love for Lorraine to convince Doc to find a way to take him back to the future, and in Part 3, Doc uses his love for Clara to convince Marty to let him stay. During both movies, we see photographs revealing a switch in timeline. Scene 11. The Florence Nightingale Effect. Doc explains that Lorraine is suffering from the Florence Nightingale effect, and during its corresponding scene in Part 3, we see Carla suffering from that same condition. Next, we see Biff sexually harassing Lorraine, as his great-grandfather makes unwanted advances upon Clara. On both occasions, Marty stands up to the Tannins, and the Stricklands intervene. Scene 12. Chasing Love. In Part 1, George's attempts to romance Lorraine fail miserably, especially after Biff shows up. Marty intervenes, and a chase ensues around the town square, which ends in Biff landing in manure and Lorraine's infatuation with Marty deepening. In Part 3, there is another chase, this time around the ravine, as Marty and Doc catch up to Clara's out-of-control carriage, which causes Clara to become infatuated with Doc. However, on this occasion, the feeling is reciprocated. Both scenes now take us to Doc's workshop.
Marty, once more, let's go over the entire plan and layout.
Sending you home.
Please excuse the crudity of this model. I didn't just have to build it to scale and paint it.
It's okay, though.
Oh, thank you.
And the parallels become even more clear. Next in Part 1, Lorraine tracks down Marty and asks him to the dance, whilst Doc looks on in astonishment. In Part 3, Clara tracks down Doc and, without saying it as such, asks him to a dance, whilst Marty looks equally perplexed. During both scenes, the DeLorean has to be quickly covered as the besotted ladies arrive. Scene 13. Connections and communication. Marty explains his plan, aimed at fixing the timeline by forming a romantic connection between his parents, so hopefully he will be born. In part 3, Doc explains his plan, aimed at breaking the timeline by preventing a romantic connection between himself and Clara, so hopefully he will not die. In part 1, Marty writes a letter to Doc, indirectly telling him how he will die in the future. But in part 3, Marty tells Doc directly about his future demise. Scene 14. Marty is captured. In both part 1 and 3, the Tannins feel they are owed a debt due to an accident involving their mode of transportation. In part 1, Biff blames Marty for the $300 he had to spend to repair his car after the manure incident. In part 3, Buford blames Doc for the $80 he spent following an accident on his horse. In part 1, Marty is thrown into the trunk of a car. In part 3, he is hung from his neck. But luckily, on both occasions, he is soon set free. Scene 15. Distant relatives. In 1955, Marty watches his parents fall in love at the dance, and in 1885 at the McFly farm, Marty also interacts with family members, none of which are aware of his true identity. Scene 16. Saving Doc. In part 1, Marty travels to the future. He attempts to warn Doc that he is going to get shot. However, he arrives too late. In part 3, Marty travels to the past, again to warn Doc he is going to get shot. And again, he doesn't quite make it. Scene 17. A revelation. Marty grieves by Doc's seemingly lifeless body. However, a few moments later, Doc sits up, revealing to Marty how he survived. Back in 1955, Marty discovers Doc's grave, and a few moments later, Doc arrives and they find out how he was killed. Scene 18. Wake-up call. In part 1, Marty is exhausted, and in part 3, Doc is unconscious, so they are driven back to their respective homes. When they awake, they initially believe that their experiences were dreams, but are soon shocked back into reality. Scene 19. An unexpected visitor. The morning after Marty returns to 1985, Doc appears out of nowhere to tell Marty they've got to go back to the future. In part 3, we see that moments after Marty travels back to the future from 1955, he suddenly reappears exclaiming he is back from the future. Scene 20. A stormy ride. Part 1 and part 3 now take us to the opening and closing of part 2. In the opening, Doc picks up Marty, and Jennifer is amazed to learn she has travelled to 2015. This worries Doc, as he feels no one should know too much about the future, so he uses a device to put her to sleep. In the closing scene, contrary to not disclosing information about the future, Doc has a letter sent out to Marty, and he is amazed to learn that Doc is stranded in 1885. Scene 21. The Almanac. Marty looks at a newspaper article which shows his future son getting arrested. Now heading towards the 80s themed cafe, Marty notices the sports almanac in a store window, beginning the chain of events that create an alternate timeline. At the end of the movie, we see Marty burning the almanac, thus removing the alternate timeline. He looks at a newspaper article which shows his dad switch from being murdered to being honoured. Scene 22. Hovering around. Marty fights with Griff near the beginning of the movie and Biff near the end of the movie, both of which result in a dramatic hoverboard chase sequence. With Griff, Marty ends up in the water, and with Biff, Marty ends up in the air. Scene 23. Stolen property. Near the start of the movie, Doc is furious with Marty for buying the almanac, so they discard it in the trash, but old Biff overhears their conversation and takes it. Later, Doc is delighted when Marty calls to say he has retrieved the almanac. However, whilst Marty listens in on a conversation, young Biff is able to steal the almanac back. Scene 24. Out of sight. Jennifer gets taken to her future house and has to sneak around as not to be seen by her future self. Meanwhile, near the end of the movie, Marty must stay out of sight at the school dance to avoid being seen by his alternate self. Jennifer witnesses Marty attempt to play the guitar, but he is crippled, whereas Marty witnesses himself rocking out like a pro. Scene 25. Bye-bye, Biff. While Marty and Doc are distracted, old Biff steals the DeLorean. When he returns, the timeline has been altered and he fades away. Closer to the end of the movie, Marty is able to steal back the almanac while Biff is distracted, knocking him out for good measure. Scene 26. A Strickland situation. Now in the alternate timeline, Marty is caught by Principal Strickland as he looks at a newspaper. Strickland threatens him with a gun and tells him that the school burned down years ago. Its corresponding scene shows Marty inside of the school, sneaking into Principal Strickland's office in an attempt to retrieve the almanac. Scene 27. $1 million. These parallel scenes both show where Biff is living. The aggressive signs and name above the door of the home of his abusive grandmother foreshadow the tower in which he later resides. Marty watches a video showing how Biff made his millions and married his mother. The corresponding action delivers the following line.
I wouldn't be your girl even if you had $1 million.
In one scene, we are shown what old Biff did after travelling back in time, and in the other scene, we see the consequences of his actions. Scene 28. Coming and going. As Marty leaves the hellish future timeline, he simultaneously arrives in the more pleasant past, and the scenes now meet in the middle, completing this chiasmus journey through time. And that concludes our own journey, exploring the Back to the Future trilogy and its figure of 8 formation. Given that the movies are themed around time travel, this is particularly clever. It is the shape of an hourglass, the infinity sign, and the theory of time travel itself also holds this form. So perhaps it is no coincidence that the speed at which time travel becomes possible is 88 miles per hour. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think in the comments box below. Now why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?